Hey guys, Sean here at the Gardener Center. So right now we're about 5 to 6 weeks away from our first killing frost here on the shoreline in Connecticut. I talked a little bit last week about how that marks the end of our growing season, but really specifically I was talking about for our annuals, but sadly enough it's also the end of the line for our summer vegetable gardens. So what I'd like to do this week is talk to you guys a bit about what you should and shouldn't be doing in your vegetable garden right now if you're still going with it. I'm going to talk to you a bit about what to do with those green tomatoes that are still on the vine that maybe won't have enough time to ripen before we get that first frost. And then I'm going to come back and talk to you about things you should be doing if you already have or are about to retire your vegetable garden for the season. Some things that are going to help you be more successful next year, so stay tuned. All right, guys, I know for a fact that many of you still have things cranking away in your vegetable gardens because I've been talking to a lot of people about it. You know, at this point, it's really mostly tomatoes, peppers, and maybe some eggplant still kicking around. Your cucumbers and squash, things like that, have probably long ago succumbed to diseases at this point. So they're pretty much out of the equation, but you very well may still have tomatoes and definitely peppers. Peppers actually do kind of well in the fall, but you should most certainly at least have those two still going in your garden. And you know, as we get closer to that frost, there's some things you want to do to make sure you can get the most out of your plants as we get closer to that date. So I'm actually going to start with some things you should stop doing if you haven't already. And I'm going to talk about tomatoes first, and then I'm going to get into the peppers a little bit. So if you have tomatoes that are still going, if you're not all tomatoed out, I know some people get tomatoed out by this point in the season, but if you're not all tomatoed out and you still have them going and you want to keep them going, you should certainly have stopped fertilizing them at this point. At this point, your tomatoes are beginning to senesce, and senesce is a fancy word, a polite way of saying dying, but they're cycling down. They're on their way out for the year. So you really don't want to fertilize them anymore. That's counterproductive. And also, if you can cut down or completely stop watering them at this point if you want to. And you know, that might be super appealing to some of you if you're like me, because I have to water my plants when I get home from work at night, and now it's like barely even light out anymore, so it's not as fun getting home and watering the plants anymore as it was a couple months ago. So you can stop watering your tomatoes at this point if you want. If any of you guys have ever been to like the southern half of Italy in the late summer or early fall before, you'll often see like fields of tomatoes that are just completely wilted over with barely any leaves on them, but like beautiful red tomatoes on them. Some may say that's where the best flavor comes from, but you know, that's for another time. But stop watering them, stop fertilizing them, because you don't want to encourage vegetative growth anymore at this point. And now here's the next step. If you do have tomatoes on your plants that look like they have the potential to be good ones, and you know, you got to kind of use your eye, use your judgment. It takes about 40 days for a flower to turn into a tomato sometimes, a ripe tomato. So we don't have 40 days left in the growing season. So flowers at this point come off. You're usually going to see your flowers at the ends of the growing tips on the top and on the sides, the little umbels of flowers, the new growth coming out. You want to take a pair of shears or scissors and you want to go through and snip all that growth off. No more flowers, no more new growth. It's gonna do a couple of things. It's going to let more light into the tomatoes that are there that you want to ripen. But what it's also going to do is it's going to divert the plant's energy away from flowers and away from new leaves and away from new stems, and it's going to divert the plant's energy exclusively to ripening up those tomatoes that are still left on the vine there. And like I said, use your eye. Usually any tomatoes that are like golf ball size or smaller, you could take those off with the flowers and the new growth. They're not going to have time. But tomatoes, you know what I'm saying, tomatoes that look like they have potential to be nice, keep those behind and let those ripen on the vine. Pepper treatment, a little different. Peppers still need water. Peppers actually crank in the fall. Peppers actually do really well in September and early October. They like the cooler night temperatures. They still need water. You can still fertilize your peppers if you want to. But what you do want to do, little differently from the tomatoes, you want to go in and just pluck the flowers off. You don't want to cut the new growth. You don't want to cut the small peppers off, because we've cooked with peppers before. A lot of times the little guys taste the same way as the big ones. So you can just gather them all up at the end. So pick the flowers off. Keep watering your peppers. It doesn't have to be every day at this point, but you don't want them to wilt. So keep them going. So that's what you should and shouldn't be doing right now, and a good way to keep them growing on the plant itself. As we get closer to the frosty nights and you still have tomatoes on your plants and you want to keep them, I mean, everyone's probably tried to ripen green tomatoes before, maybe with mixed results. They almost never taste the same way as they do on the vine, and there's reason for that. A couple ways you can do it. When a tomato is still on a vine that's growing, they need to ripen in sunlight. As soon as the tomatoes are removed from the plants, they need to ripen in the dark. Tomatoes ripen from the inside out. A lot of people think they ripen from the outside in, but it's actually the opposite. So tomatoes need to ripen in a dark, cool place. A lot of times your basement or your garage could be perfect if you have a lot of them. You could actually cut the tomato stem at the base and hang the whole thing up from the rafters in your basement and pretend you're in Italy if you want to. You know, it's got that look. It's a great way to do it. If you have a smaller amount of tomatoes, it's okay to put them in brown grocery bags. You know, maybe put a dozen or so in a brown grocery bag and close it up in a dark place. That's where they're going to ripen best. The peppers, just before we get a freeze, just pick them off. Like I said, the big ones and the small ones are usually taste about the same. So those are some things to keep in mind as we go through September and October about some of your summer plants. I'm going to come right back and talk to you a little bit about wrapping up your garden for the season, so stick around. All right, guys, so if you're done with your summer vegetable garden already, or if you're going to wait to the bitter end and get as much as you can out of it, there's a couple things you can do to help you be a little more successful next year. Maybe some things you haven't heard of before. And you know, if you're growing vegetables, if you're new to it, or even if you've been doing it for a few years, a lot of vegetables are very prone to diseases. We've talked about vegetable diseases all summer. If you've grown tomatoes or squash or cucumbers, you know what I'm talking about. They can be disease bags sometimes. So there are some steps you can take to kind of alleviate that a little bit next year. Most of the diseases, the fungal diseases that we get into our tomatoes and our cucumbers and squash, things like that, a lot of those pathogens overwinter in debris and in the soil in your vegetable garden over the winter. And I mean, think about it, that's done by design. And that's so the pathogen is sitting there right underneath the plants it wants to get on again next year when you put them back. So sanitation is key if you grow vegetables that have disease issues, and again, usually tomatoes, cucumber, squash. So when you are done with them, you want to remove the entire tomato plant. And when I say remove, I mean yank it out of the ground. Don't cut them at the ground. You want to pull them out, roots and all, as many as you can get. A lot of people will say you can put your tomato plants in the compost pile. I like to play it safe, and just if anything that had disease, mildew, septoria, blight, let's get it in a plastic bag and send it to the landfill. There's no reason to take any chances. So that's number one sanitation method. Another one that's really important that people don't often think about, so we use stakes and we use tomato cages. We use supports for our tomatoes. Well, those same pathogens can actually overwinter on your support mechanisms. So I know a lot of people just yank the cages and the stakes and throw them in the garage or throw them in the shed, but do yourself a favor, and before you put them away, after you pull them out, before you put them away, get them in the driveway somewhere and hose them down, and hit them with like a 1 part bleach to 10 part water solution, or you could even use, like, if you have like a household bathroom cleaner or kitchen cleaner, like a disinfectant, antibacterial one, spray them down with that before you put them away for the winter, because a lot of those bad pathogens can actually winter over on your tomato cages, and then guess what happens next year when your tomatoes are in the tomato cages again? You know, the pathogens are happy, but your tomatoes not so much. So clean those guys up. Another thing that's good, not as heavily as you would in the springtime, but I always like to add just a small layer of fresh compost over the top of the garden bed when you're done with it for the season. Compost takes a while to break down, so it's nice to give it the winter, you know, the whole 6 months that it's going to be not planted to break down. It's a good start for next year. So that's going to be a really helpful thing, you know, to improve the soil in the long run. Guys, I have an unsolicited plug here. You see all these beautiful gourds and pumpkins that I'm standing in front of here. So we love to put these on our doorsteps this time of year as decorations, but you know, we're talking about vegetables. These guys, 99% of these are actually edible. These are all heirloom squashes. They're actually, mostly of them are pumpkins, but they're heirlooms. They've been bred. Some of them are 100 years old. They have many culinary uses. And again, an unsolicited plug, there's a wonderful website called autumnornamentals.com, all one word. They've even got a nice mobile version that you can look at on your phone. It tells you the name of the pumpkin or the gourd, where it came from, and how to use it in your kitchen. So as you're shopping for these things to put on your porch, remember, you can keep them around and eat them for Thanksgiving, because they're winter squash and they last a long time. So as you're picking them out, don't think just think about decorations. Think about how you might use them in the kitchen later on. Guys, always thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.